The dust of forward operating base terminus tasted of rust and regret. It was a fine, pale grit that worked its way into everything. The threads of a uniform, the action of a rifle, the back of a throat. For Specialist Anya Petrova, it was just another flavor of solitude. She stood at the edge of the long-distance firing range, a place of loud noises and quiet calculations, observing the heat shimmer distort the distant, scarred targets. A general was coming, and he would try to take her rifle. It was a certainty as reliable as the scorching sun overhead. Soon, he would demand she put her hands away, and she would have to remind him and everyone else exactly who she was. The turning point would not be loud, not at first. It would be a stillness, a refusal, followed by the undeniable thunder of her .50 caliber reply. Her official posting was a masterpiece of bureaucratic irony. After a career spent in shadows so deep they had no names, she was now assigned to the S4 Logistics Division, specifically as an overseer for the Armory's range operations. It was a job for a broken-down sergeant first class counting the days to retirement, not for a woman whose hands were steadier than bedrock. She was a ghost in plain sight, her file a heavily redacted fiction that painted her as a competent but unremarkable supply specialist with a knack for weapons maintenance. The truth was buried under layers of black ink and national security classifications. Here, she was just Petrova, the quiet woman who spent too much time with the heavy arms. The base itself was an ulcer on the face of the desert, a collection of sand-colored containers and tents huddled together against an unforgiving landscape. Jagged mountains, the color of dried blood, clawed at the horizon. The wind was a constant, abrasive whisper, carrying the scent of diesel and sun-baked earth. To the soldiers garrisoned here, it was a purgatory. To Anya, it was simply a place to be. It was quiet, it was orderly, and it had a range that stretched out to 3,000 meters. Her arrival a month prior had caused barely a ripple. She reported for duty, was given her billet, and shown the armory. The master sergeant in charge, a man named Henderson whose belly strained the buttons of his uniform, had looked at her with undisguised skepticism. "You're the new range tech? You ever handled anything bigger than a service pistol?" Anya had simply looked at the rack of M107A1 sniper rifles, her gaze lingering on one in particular. "I can manage," she had said, her voice low and even. She gravitated to that specific rifle. It was older than the others, its finish worn smooth in places where hands and slings had rested for countless hours. To everyone else, it was just another piece of inventory. To Anya, it was an old friend. She spent the first week stripping it down to its component parts, cleaning each pin and spring with a surgeon's precision. She measured the headspace, polished the bolt carrier group until it glided with silent efficiency, and torqued the scope rings to the exact inch-pound specification. She worked in the suffocating heat of the armory, oblivious to the sweat beading on her brow, her focus absolute. The younger soldiers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. They saw a woman of indeterminate age, her face stoic and unlined but for the fine creases at the corners of her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She moved with a quiet economy, never a wasted step or motion. She was a fixed point in their transient world of drills and boredom. One of them, a corporal named Ben Carter, was more observant than the rest. He was barely 20, his face still holding the softness of youth, but his eyes were sharp. He was a decent marksman himself, and he recognized the difference between procedure and ritual. He saw the way Anya handled the M107A1. She didn't just clean it, she communed with it. He saw her on the range during off hours, not shooting, but just standing at the firing line, her eyes scanning the distance, her head tilted as if listening to the wind. "What's her deal?" Carter asked his fire team leader one afternoon, nodding towards Anya as she meticulously adjusted the bipod on the big rifle. "Who, Petrova?" Sergeant Miller grunted, wiping grease from his hands. "Beats me. Henderson says her file is weird. All logistics but with a bunch of marksman quals. Probably some REMF who got lucky on a few tests, rear echelon motherfucker. The universal pejorative for anyone who wasn't infantry." But Carter wasn't so sure. He saw the way she checked the wind. She didn't just look at the tattered orange windsock. She watched the subtle dance of dust motes 100 meters out, the ripple of mirage off a steel plate at 1,000, the almost imperceptible sway of a lone, desiccated bush on a ridge at 2,000. She was reading a language he barely knew existed. He saw subtle hints of an immense, contained skill, a placid lake that ran fathoms deep. He decided to keep his distance, but to keep watching. He had a feeling that Specialist Anya Petrova was far more than she appeared. A coiled spring waiting for the right pressure to be applied. That pressure was now arriving, heralded by the distant thrum of helicopter blades beating against the brassy sky. General Marcus Thorne was coming to FOB Terminus, and the quiet on the range was about to be broken. General Thorne moved through the base like a storm front, his presence sucking the air out of every room he entered. He was a tall man, built like a battering ram, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite and a voice that could strip paint. He was accompanied by a coterie of nervous aides and the equally stressed base commander, Colonel Davies. Thorne's visits were not social calls. They were inquisitions. He believed discipline was a function of fear, and he was exceptionally good at inspiring it. His inspection tour was a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. He found fault with the motor pool's maintenance logs, the mess hall sanitation standards, and the perimeter guard's posture. By the time his entourage made its way to the firing range, the entire base was clenched in a state of high anxiety. The heat, the dust, the ever-present tension, it all seemed to amplify under his gaze. The range was active, with a platoon running through marksmanship qualifications. The pop-pop-pop of M4 carbines was a familiar, almost soothing rhythm. But at the far end of the firing line, sectioned off for heavy-caliber weapons, was a single, deafening concussion that dwarfed the others. Boom! The sound hit the chest like a physical blow. It was a soldier firing the M107A1, the round kicking up a plume of dust from the distant backstop. General Thorne's eyes immediately locked onto the source of the sound. He strode down the line, his polished boots crunching on the gravel, his aides scrambling to keep up. Standing a few feet behind the prone shooter was Anya Petrova. She held a spotting scope, her body perfectly still as she observed the shot's impact. She wore simple fatigues, her rank of specialist barely visible on her collar. She was a study in stillness amidst the noise and nervous energy. Thorne stopped, his shadow falling over her. He ignored her completely, turning instead to Colonel Davies. "Who is this?" he demanded. His voice a low growl that carried over the sound of gunfire. He gestured dismissively toward Anya. "What is a logistics clerk doing on my firing line during a live-fire exercise?" Colonel Davies, sweating profusely in the dry heat, stammered. "Sir, that's Specialist Petrova. She's from S4, assigned to the armory. She oversees safety and maintenance for the heavy weapons." Thorne's gaze finally settled on Anya. It was a look of profound condescension, the kind a king might give a scullery maid. He saw a woman, out of place in his world of hardened men and powerful weapons. He saw a low rank, a support role. He saw nothing of value. "Specialist," he said, drawing the word out as if it tasted foul. "Your job is to count ammunition, not to play with it. This is a place for soldiers. Return to your supply depot." Anya lowered the spotting scope, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She turned to face him. Her expression was neutral, her eyes calm. "My duties include observing the performance of the weapon systems and ensuring proper procedure." General, her voice was even, without a trace of deference or fear. It was simply a statement of fact. This lack of immediate, terrified compliance seemed to infuriate Thorne more than any argument could have. He saw it as insubordination. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, using his size to intimidate. "I did not ask for a recitation of your duties, Specialist. I gave you an order. Are you incapable of understanding a simple instruction?" Behind the general, Corporal Carter watched from the adjacent firing point, his own rifle forgotten. He saw the general's bullying posture, the tightening of his jaw, and he saw Anya's response. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply held his gaze. There was no defiance in her eyes, but there was also no submission. There was only a quiet, unshakable self-possession. "I understand the instructions, sir," she replied, her voice still perfectly level. "But my station is here." Thorne scoffed, a short, sharp sound of contempt. He turned away from her, a final gesture of dismissal, and addressed Colonel Davies again. "Colonel, get your people in order. I will not have my inspection disrupted by clerks who think they're operators. Remove her from my sight." He then strode away toward the main observation tower, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. Colonel Davies looked at Anya, his face a mask of panic and frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, to order her away, but the words wouldn't come. There was something in her stillness that gave him pause, a sense of authority that had nothing to do with the rank on her collar. Anya, for her part, did not look at the flustered colonel. Her attention had already returned to the range, her eyes once again scanning the vast, sun-bleached expanse. The general's dismissal was a minor distraction, a buzzing insect she had already swatted away. Her focus was on the things that mattered, the wind, the light, the distance. The problem was not the general. The problem was always the shot. Anya's mind was a complex, silent engine of calculation. The general's words, his presence, were mere data points, variables to be noted and filed away. They did not touch the core of her focus. While the men around her saw a barren wasteland, a field of dirt and rock, Anya saw a living, breathing tapestry of environmental information. Her senses were honed to a degree that was almost preternatural, a skill born from thousands of hours spent in similar landscapes, where a single miscalculation meant the difference between life and death. Her eyes, which Thorne had dismissed as unremarkable, were scanning the full 3,000-meter length of the range. She wasn't just looking. She was deconstructing the scene. The wind was the most critical element, and it was never a single, uniform force. It was a river with currents, eddies, and cross-currents. She saw the evidence of its behavior everywhere. A tattered piece of plastic caught on a barbed wire fence at 300 meters fluttered erratically, indicating a turbulent ground wind. Further out, around 800 meters, she watched the mirage, the shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground. It wasn't rising straight up. It was drifting slightly from right to left, a gentle but persistent 5-mile-per-hour breeze. But that was only part of the story. Above the ground, she saw a dust devil, a miniature cyclone, form and dissipate near a rocky outcrop at 1,500 meters. That suggested an updraft, a vertical component to the wind that would lift the heavy 50-caliber bullet, making it strike high if not accounted for. On the high ridge that formed the final backstop, nearly 2 miles away, a lone, skeletal tree stood. Its upper branches, barely visible to the naked eye, trembled in a different rhythm, indicating a faster, colder wind coming down off the mountains. She was mentally mapping these wind zones, assigning velocities and directions to each one, building a complex, three-dimensional model of the bullet's potential path. Then there was the light. The sun was high and brutal, casting short, sharp shadows. The glare was intense, threatening to wash out the targets. But Anya knew how to use it. She noted the angle of the sun and how it reflected off the steel plates. A target that seemed bright and clear now would be plunged into shadow as the earth turned. She also studied the air itself. It was not empty space. It was thick with dust and humidity, microscopic particles that would create drag, ever so slightly slowing the projectile over its long flight. The temperature, a blistering 110 degrees Fahrenheit, would make the air less dense, allowing the bullet to travel faster, but it would also magnify the mirage, making a clear sight picture a challenge. She absorbed it all, the temperature, the barometric pressure she could feel in her sinuses, the humidity. It was all part of the firing solution. She watched the other shooters, the young soldiers from the visiting platoon. She saw their eagerness and their inexperience. She saw one soldier jerk his trigger, anticipating the recoil, sending his shot wide. She saw another whose breathing was ragged and inconsistent, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uncontrolled movements, destroying any chance of a stable platform. She saw a third who failed to account for cant, the rifle tilted ever so slightly, a tiny error that would become a multi-foot miss at 1,000 meters. She cataloged their mistakes without judgment. They were learning. They were practicing a craft. For her, it was no longer a craft. It was an extension of her own being, as natural and unconscious as breathing. Her internal monologue was a silent stream of numbers and corrections. Range, 1,250 meters. Wind 1, 4 miles per hour, full value from 3 o'clock. Wind 2, 7 miles per hour, 1 o'clock, starting at 900 meters. Updraft at 1100. Temperature, 43 Celsius. Pressure, 298 inches of mercury. Coriolis effect negligible at this range, but spin drift will push it right by 10 inches. Elevation, 82 mils up. Windage, 19 mils left. It flowed through her mind effortlessly. She could feel the shot before it was ever fired, tracing its parabola through the air, seeing its impact on the steel. Corporal Carter, having finished his own round of shooting, watched her. He saw her eyes, unfocused yet intensely concentrated, sweeping the landscape. He had been taught to look at the windsock to check a kestrel weather meter. He was watching her use nothing but her own senses to gather more data than his electronics ever could. He was beginning to understand. This wasn't a clerk. This wasn't a supply specialist. This was something else entirely. And he felt a growing sense of dread, because he knew General Thorne had made a profound and dangerous mistake. He had not dismissed a soldier. He had insulted an artist, and the range was her canvas. The true reason for General Thorne's visit to this forgotten outpost was not a simple inspection. It was a high-stakes demonstration. Tucked away in a secure section of the base was the XM-200, the Argus system, a fully automated, remote-operated sniper platform. It was a sleek, menacing turret, bristling with optics and sensors, capable of mounting anything from a 338 Lapua to a 50 BMG. Argus was Thorne's baby, a multi-billion-dollar project he had championed through the Pentagon's labyrinthine procurement process. It was meant to be the future of warfare. Cold, efficient, and unerringly precise, removing the flawed human element from long-range engagements. Today was supposed to be its triumphant public debut for a select group of congressional aides and defense contractors who had flown in with the general. The demonstration was staged on the main range. A series of targets were positioned at varying distances, from 800 to 2,000 meters. A technician in a climate-controlled van sat at a console, his fingers poised over a joystick and keyboard. General Thorne stood beside the van, narrating the system's capabilities with booming confidence. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice amplified by a portable speaker system, "you are about to witness a revolution." The Argus system utilizes a state-of-the-art ballistic computer, linked to a laser rangefinder and a full environmental sensor suite. It calculates for wind, temperature, even the rotation of the Earth, all in a fraction of a second. It does not feel fatigue. It does not feel pressure. It simply executes. On the large screen displaying the turret's view, the crosshairs settled on the first target, a standard silhouette at 800 meters. The technician made a final adjustment. "Target locked. Firing," he said in a monotone voice. A mechanical whir, a loud crack from the turret's 338 rifle, and a puff of dust erupted from the backstop, a full 2 feet to the left of the target. A nervous silence fell over the viewing area. Thorne's smile tightened. "A minor calibration issue," he said, waving it off. "The extreme heat can sometimes affect the initial cold bore shot. Let's proceed to the next target." The turret swiveled to a 1,200-meter plate. Again the whir, the crack, and this time the shot was even further off, kicking up dirt low and to the right. The technician started tapping furiously at his keyboard. "Sir, I'm getting an error message. The heat is affecting the primary sensor array. The Mirage is throwing off the laser rangefinder." The third shot missed by an even wider margin. The fourth failed to fire at all, the system freezing completely. The demonstration was an unmitigated disaster. The sleek, futuristic weapon sat inert, a monument to failure under the desert sun. The congressional aides began to murmur amongst themselves, their expressions shifting from impressed to skeptical. The contractors looked deeply uncomfortable. General Thorne's face was a thundercloud. His pet project, his key to a third star, had just imploded in front of the very people he needed to impress. He turned on the lead engineer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his usual roar. "You assured me this system was ready. You told me it was foolproof. The conditions, General?" The engineer stammered, sweat pouring down his face. "We never tested it in this level of sustained heat and particulate matter. The software can't compensate for the density of the mirage." Thorne wasn't listening. He was radiating pure fury. His reputation was being shredded with every passing second of humiliating failure. He needed to salvage the situation, to regain control, to project strength. His eyes, burning with frustration, swept across the range, searching for a distraction, a scapegoat, anything to shift the focus away from the dead turret. And then he saw her. Anya Petrova was still there, at the far end of the firing line, standing quietly by the M107A1. She had watched the entire debacle without a flicker of expression. In Thorne's enraged mind, her calm, silent presence felt like a judgment. She was a symbol of the old way, the flawed human element he was trying to replace, and in this moment, his magnificent machine had failed while she simply stood and watched. She became the focal point for all his pent-up rage and humiliation. He needed to reassert the natural order of things, and she would be the instrument of that reassertion. He started walking towards her, his stride long and aggressive, his fists clenched at his sides. The pressure that had been building all day had found its target. Thorne's heavy boots ground the gravel underfoot as he closed the distance to Anya. His entourage, sensing the impending explosion, followed at a hesitant distance. He was no longer a commander. He was a wounded animal, lashing out. He stopped directly in front of the M107A1, which rested on its bipod, its long barrel pointing downrange. He jabbed a thumb towards the inert Argus turret. "Technology can have a bad day," he announced, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He was performing now, trying to claw back his authority. "But this—" He slapped the receiver of the big rifle, the sound a sharp crack in the tense air. "This is about pure, undeniable skill. It's about the soldier, not the machine." He turned his burning gaze on Anya. She hadn't moved. She stood with her hands loosely clasped behind her back, her posture relaxed but alert. She was a rock in the path of his storm. "Step aside, specialist," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm going to show these gentlemen what a real marksman can do. I'll demonstrate the fundamentals." It was a desperate gambit, a piece of political theater designed to erase the memory of his failed project. He reached for the pistol grip of the rifle, intending to settle in behind it. Anya moved, but not in the way he expected. She didn't step aside. She took one small, precise step forward, placing herself between the general and the weapon. Her right hand came up and rested gently, almost casually, on the top of the rifle's receiver. Her fingers wrapped around the scope mount. It was not an aggressive gesture, but it was an unmistakable barrier. "Sir," she said, her voice still quiet, yet it cut through the air with absolute clarity. "The weapon is zeroed for me. The ballistic profile is calculated for my dope." Thorne froze, his hand hovering inches from the grip. He stared at her, his mind struggling to process the blatant defiance. A specialist, a female logistics clerk, was physically preventing him from taking a weapon. It was unthinkable. "I gave you an order," he hissed, his face contorting with rage. "Put your hands away." His own hand shot out, not to fire the weapon, but to shove her aside by grabbing the rifle itself. He intended to rip it from her grasp, to assert his dominance through sheer physical force. The moment his fingers touched the rifle, hers closed over his. It was not a struggle. It was a cessation of movement. Her grip was not crushing, not violent. It was simply absolute. It was as if he had tried to move a mountain that had suddenly grown a hand and decided to hold him in place. All the strength in his powerful frame was useless against the unyielding pressure of her fingers. Her strength was not in her muscles, but in her bones, in her technique, in a lifetime of focused discipline channeled into a single point of contact. The world on the firing range seemed to contract to that one spot. The general's hand, trapped beneath the specialist's. The rhythmic pop of the M4S had ceased. Every soldier on the line had stopped shooting. Their heads turned to watch the silent, unbelievable confrontation. Colonel Davies looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Corporal Carter held his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped his own rifle. The wind itself seemed to die down, holding its breath with the rest of them. Thorne tried to pull his hand away, but he couldn't. Her grip held him fast. He was trapped, not by force, but by a quiet, immovable will. He could see her eyes now, and for the first time he saw past the rank and the gender. He saw a flicker of something ancient and dangerous, a placid surface over an abyss of cold, hard capability. The humiliation of the Argus failure was nothing compared to this. This was personal. This was primal. He, a general, was being physically controlled by a subordinate, and it was happening in front of everyone. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Thorne's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions. Shock, rage, disbelief, and finally, a sliver of dawning, horrified comprehension. He was completely and utterly out of his depth. With a final, desperate wrench, he pulled his hand free. It was not because he overpowered her, but because she simply let him go. She released him. The decision had been hers. Thorne stumbled back a step, cradling his hand as if it had been burned. His chest heaved. The silence on the range was now absolute, a ringing, judgmental void. He had been publicly challenged, physically dominated, and his authority was in tatters. He looked at Anya, at her calm, impassive face, and he knew he had only one way out. He couldn't discipline her, he couldn't strike her, he couldn't have her arrested without looking weak and foolish. He had to break her. He had to prove that her defiance was a fluke, that her quiet confidence was an empty shell. He had to make her fail. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. The rage in his eyes cooled, replaced by a chilling, predatory focus. He had found his path to victory. "You think you're qualified to handle this weapon?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was no longer trying to intimidate her. He was setting a trap. Anya's response was simple, delivered without a trace of arrogance or hesitation. "Yes, sir." The words hung in the air, a direct and undeniable challenge. The shift in power was palpable. It was no longer a general berating a specialist. It was now a contest. "Fine," Thorne said, the smile widening. He savored the word. "Prove it." He spun around, his eyes scanning the distant, shimmering landscape, searching for the impossible. His gaze swept past the standard targets, the easy shots, the known distances. He was looking for a task so monumental, so absurdly difficult, that failure was a foregone conclusion. He would not just defeat her, he would annihilate her credibility. He turned to the range safety officer, a grizzled master sergeant who had seen everything. "Master Sergeant, what is the most difficult target on this range?" "I want the shot that no one can make." The RSO hesitated, glancing nervously from the furious general to the preternaturally calm specialist. He pointed towards a distant canyon, a shadowed cleft in the mountainside that was notorious for its treacherous winds. "That would be the hostage plate, sir. At 1,800 meters. It's a 12-inch plate, partially obscured by that rock formation. The wind shear in that canyon. It's a gamble at best. Haven't seen anyone hit it in years." "Excellent," Thorne declared, a triumphant ring in his voice. He pointed a rigid finger towards the barely visible speck. "That one. Put a round on it." But he wasn't finished. He wanted to build a monument to her failure. He let his eyes roam the horizon, picking out other, equally improbable points of aim. "And after that," he continued, his voice dripping with malice, the moving target simulator at 1,500 meters, then the communications antenna on that relay tower on Ridgeback Peak. That must be 2,400 meters. Oh, and see that old fuel drum on the far side of the valley? Put a hole in that too. He was inventing a course of fire from hell, a series of shots that would test the absolute limits of both weapon and shooter. He paused, looking for a suitably impossible finale. And when you've missed all of those, we'll call it a day. He turned back to Anya, his expression one of pure, vindictive certainty. The trap was set. All she had to do was step into it. Anya met his gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something moved in her eyes. It wasn't fear or hesitation. It was acceptance. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She then turned away from him, her back to the gallery of stunned onlookers, and addressed the M107A1. The contest was on. Her movements were a study in fluid efficiency, a ballet of practiced discipline that silenced any remaining doubt that she was out of her place. She did not rush. She did not show any sign of pressure. She simply began her process. With a grace that seemed impossible for the sheer size of the weapon, she settled into a prone position behind the rifle. The earth was hot against her body, but she didn't seem to notice. The rifle stock found the pocket of her shoulder as if it were a missing piece of her own anatomy. Her left hand gently supported the rear stock, while her right found the pistol grip. She was no longer a woman with a rifle. They were a single, integrated weapon system. The crowd, from the general down to the lowest private, watched in spellbound silence. They were about to witness a masterclass. Her face was a mask of concentration. Her eyes, half closed, were not looking through the scope yet. They were scanning the environment one last time, absorbing the final, subtle shifts in the wind and light. Her mind, already primed, began the final, intricate calculations. It was a storm of data. Barometric pressure, temperature, humidity, spin drift, the Coriolis effect pulling the bullet eastward on its long journey. She processed it all not as abstract numbers, in the way the Argus system's computer would, but as a felt reality and intuitive understanding of physics. Her fingers moved to the turrets of her high-powered scope. Click, click, click. The precise, tactile sounds were the only ones in the profound silence. She dialed in her elevation, a significant upward adjustment to arc the heavy bullet over such a vast distance. Click, click. Another series of adjustments for windage, compensating for the invisible currents she had mapped in her mind. Only then did she put her eye to the scope. The world sprang into sharp, magnified focus. The mirage was a flowing river of distortion, but she had learned long ago to read it, to aim through it, to use its patterns to confirm her wind calls. Her breathing slowed, deepening into a controlled, rhythmic cycle. Inhale, exhale. She found her natural respiratory pause, the moment of perfect stillness between breaths. Her target was the hostage plate at 1,800 meters. Through the powerful optic, it was a tiny sliver of white steel, partially hidden behind a finger of rust-colored rock. It was a shot that demanded perfection. A fraction of an inch of error in her aim, a single mile-per-hour miscalculation of the wind, and the bullet would miss by yards. Her finger curled around the trigger. She didn't pull it. She began to apply pressure, slowly, steadily, increasing it until the rifle, not her, would decide the exact moment of the shot. Her entire world contracted to the sight picture, the crosshairs steady on the sliver of white. Boom! The rifle exploded with a deafening roar, a physical concussion that rolled across the range. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a familiar and welcome jolt, but her body absorbed it perfectly. The weapon barely bucked. Through the scope, she watched the vapor trail of the bullet, a faint, fleeting corkscrew in the air, as it raced towards the horizon. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The flight time was an eternity. The crowd held its collective breath. Ping. The sound was faint, almost lost in the vastness of the desert, but it was utterly unmistakable. It was the sound of a 2,700-grain projectile hitting steel at over a mile away. In Corporal Carter's binoculars, the white plate kicked back violently and a tiny puff of pulverized lead and paint dust appeared. "Hit," Carter breathed, his voice trembling with awe. "Direct hit." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. General Thorne's jaw was tight. It was a lucky shot, he told himself. A complete fluke. "The mover," he barked, his voice harsh. "Now!" An operator activated the moving target, a steel silhouette that began to slide along a track at 1,500 meters, disappearing and reappearing between obstacles. Anya didn't hesitate. She worked the bolt on the rifle, the heavy action smooth and sure, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. She tracked the target, her movements fluid. This was a different kind of calculation, one of speed and lead. She didn't aim at the target. She aimed at the empty space where it was going to be. Her mind calculated the target speed, the bullet's flight time, and the intersection point. Again, her breathing slowed. Again, the steady pressure on the trigger. Boom! The rifle roared again. She was already on the bolt, her eyes still in the scope, watching the bullet's trace. The steel silhouette was just emerging from behind a concrete barrier when the round arrived. The impact was spectacular, spinning the heavy target off its track with a screech of tortured metal. Another perfect hit. The murmurs grew louder. Thorne's face was now a mask of disbelief. This wasn't luck. "The fuel drum," he snapped, changing the order, his voice strained. The drum on the ridge, it was further out, over 2,200 meters. A different set of environmental challenges. Anya adjusted her scope again. More clicks of elevation. The air was thinner at that altitude. The wind would be different. She took a moment, her eye away from the scope, reading the world again. She settled back into her firing position. The drum was a fat, rusted cylinder, a much larger target, but the distance was immense, well into the territory of extreme long-range shooting where physics became a cruel mistress. She took 2 full breath cycles this time, calming her heart rate, letting her body find its absolute center. Boom! The wait was even longer this time, nearly 5 seconds. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a silent blossom of orange and brown dust erupted from the side of the drum. A fraction of a second later, the faint, metallic thump of the impact reached them. The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were staring, silent and awestruck. They were witnessing something that defied belief. Colonel Davies looked at the general, whose face had gone pale. The vindictive certainty was gone, replaced by a growing, sickening dread. He had not set a trap for a specialist. He had challenged a force of nature. Thorne was losing control, not just of the situation, but of his own perception of reality. The smug certainty he had worn like armor was cracking piece by piece, with each impossible shot. He stared at Anya's prone form, at the utter lack of celebration or emotion. She just worked the bolt, ejecting the spent shell, her movements as rhythmic and predictable as a tide. He had intended to humiliate her, but instead, he was being dismantled in front of his own men and the very people he sought to impress. "The antenna," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed a trembling finger at the communications tower on the distant ridge. At 2,400 meters, it was a needle against the sky, a vertical line only inches wide. It was a shot that belonged in a Hollywood movie, not on a real-world firing range. It was a shot of pure desperation. Anya adjusted her scope once more, the clicks of the turret sounding like a death knell for the general's arrogance. This shot was different. It wasn't about hitting a plate. It was about hitting a line. The slightest error in windage would result in a clean miss. The margin for error was 0. She settled behind the rifle, but this time, she didn't fire immediately. She waited. Her eye was pressed to the scope, but her other senses were reaching out, feeling the air. She was waiting for the lull, the brief, precious moment when the cross-currents of wind would momentarily align, creating a stable corridor for the bullet's passage. The soldiers watched, forgetting the heat, forgetting the dust. They were transfixed. They were watching an artist at the peak of her powers. A full minute passed. Thorne started to open his mouth, perhaps to mock her for hesitating, but he was silenced by a look from Colonel Davies. Then she fired. Boom! The sound was the same, but the anticipation was 1,000 times greater. Every eye was strained, trying to see the invisible. The wait stretched on, 6 long seconds of agonizing silence. Then, through his binoculars, Carter saw it. The slender antenna at the top of the tower whipped violently, as if struck by a giant, invisible hand. It oscillated back and forth, the movement stark against the clear blue sky. "Hit," Carter said again. But this time his voice was filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. "My God! She hit the antenna!" A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a shot that shouldn't have been possible. It defied the laws of probability. Thorne stumbled back, his face ashen. He looked around at the faces of his aides, the contractors, the soldiers. He saw his own disbelief reflected in their wide eyes. He was beaten. He knew it. But his pride, his rage, his humiliation, demanded one last, futile gesture of defiance. His eyes scanned the landscape wildly, searching for a final, impossible task. He saw a glint of light, a flicker of reflected sun from a piece of trash. A broken bottle, a discarded can, lying amidst the rocks on a mountain slope far beyond any designated target. It was a random speck of light in a sea of brown and gray. "That," he said, his voice cracking, "hit that glint." The range safety officer stepped forward. "Sir, that's not a target. It's just a reflection. We can't even range it properly." "Do it!" Thorne roared, his composure finally shattering. Anya showed no reaction. She simply shifted her position slightly, scanning the mountainside through her scope. Finding the glint was a challenge in itself. It was a tiny, moving point of light. She found it, held it, and watched it for a long moment. She made a final, tiny adjustment to her scope. This was no longer about marksmanship. This was about something deeper. This was a conversation, and she was about to have the last word. She took a single, slow breath. Boom! The rifle fired. The glint vanished. It did not return. There was one shot left in her self-imposed course of fire. 8 targets. She had hit 5. Thorne had stopped calling them out. The challenge was now between her and the universe. She worked the bolt, chambering another round. Her target was not distant. It was at a mere 1,000 meters. But it was symbolic. She swiveled the heavy rifle, the movement smooth and deliberate, until the crosshairs settled on the failed Argus turret. She bypassed the main chassis, the optics, the gun barrel. She aimed for something small, something fundamental. She aimed for one of the large mounting bolts that held the entire turret to its concrete base. It was a target no bigger than a silver dollar. She did not wait. She did not calculate. This shot was not for the crowd. It was for her. Boom! The rifle thundered for the 6th, 7th. No, the 8th time. There were 2 more shots after the glint, so fast and fluid that they blended together. A small, insignificant target at 2,000 meters, the hinge on a target carrier, and another at 2,500, the ceramic insulator on a power line pole. Hits. All hits. The final shot at the Argus turret was the exclamation point. The sharp, clear clang of the bullet striking the bolt echoed back across the range, and the multi-million-dollar turret slumped visibly to one side. Its head canted at a broken, pathetic angle. 8 shots. 8 impossible targets. 8 undeniable statements. Anya Petrova laid her cheek against the still warm stock of the rifle for a moment. Her eyes closed. Then, with the same unhurried grace, she got to her feet. The performance was over. A silence deeper and more profound than any before descended upon the range. It was a silence filled with awe, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying respect. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the faint, metallic tinkle of the last ejected shell casing as it cooled in the dust. Anya stood and began to clear her weapon, her movements economical and precise, as if she had just completed a simple, routine task. She did not look at General Thorne. She did not look at the stunned crowd. Her focus was solely on the rifle, her partner in the extraordinary display they had just witnessed. Into the silence walked a new figure. Sergeant Major Elias Vance had arrived in a dusty Humvee midway through Anya's performance. He was a command sergeant major from the regional headquarters, an old warrior with a face like a worn leather map and eyes that had seen decades of conflict. He hadn't come for the demonstration. He was on a routine liaison visit. He had heard the distinctive, thunderous reports of the .50 caliber and had wandered over to the range to observe. He had watched the last 3 shots, his experienced eyes missing nothing. He had seen the shooter's form, the perfect recoil management, the almost psychic connection between the woman and her weapon. And it had stirred a memory. He walked forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, his eyes locked on Anya. He ignored the general and his entourage completely. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away from her. "I've only ever seen one person shoot like that," Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried in the still air. "A ghost. But the official story says she's been dead for 10 years. Said she was killed in the Hindu Kush." Anya paused in her work, her hands still on the rifle. She did not turn to face him, but she canted her head slightly, acknowledging his presence. Vance took a few more steps, his eyes narrowing. He was looking for something specific. As Anya reached down to release the bipod, the cuff of her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing her wrist. There, faded by sun and time, was a small, stylized tattoo of a kestrel in mid-dive. Vance stopped dead. The blood drained from his face. He breathed a single word, a name that was spoken only in hushed, reverent tones in the darkest corners of the Special Operations community. A name that was synonymous with impossible missions and legendary feats of arms. "Kestrel," he whispered. General Thorne, who had been standing frozen like a statue, finally broke his paralysis. "What did you say, Sergeant Major? What is that name?" Vance finally turned to face the general. The look in the old soldier's eyes was one of profound, pitying disbelief. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of awe and anger, "with all due respect, you need to shut your mouth. That is not Specialist Petrova." He pointed a trembling finger at Anya. "That is Kestrel. She was the lead sniper and solo reconnaissance operator for Task Force Nomad. They didn't officially exist. The unit was wiped out during Operation Cinderfall. The report said she was the sole survivor, that she held off an enemy battalion for 72 hours, alone with a Barrett M82, covering the exfil of a downed SEAL team. The file is sealed so far above top secret it doesn't have a name." While Vance spoke, one of Thorne's aides, a young, tech-savvy captain, had been furiously typing on a hardened tablet, trying to access the restricted personnel files. His own security clearance was high, but he kept hitting digital walls. Finally, using the sergeant major's call sign as a keyword, he found a ghost file, a heavily encrypted and redacted summary. His eyes widened in shock. He looked up at the general, his face pale. "Sir, he's right. The file is... My God. Anya Petrova. Distinguished Service Cross, classified. Silver Star, classified. Bronze Star with Valor, 7 of them, all classified. The after-action report on Cinderfall, sir. It says she had 8 confirmed kills beyond 2,500 meters during that engagement alone. The final entry just says, subject reassigned to non-operational duties for personal recovery. All records sealed under the Echo 7 protocol, sir. She's a ghost. She's a living legend." The full, crushing weight of what had just transpired finally crashed down upon General Marcus Thorne. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. The man he had bullied, the woman he had dismissed, the specialist he had tried to humiliate, was not just a competent soldier. She was an icon, a warrior spoken of in the same hushed tones as the greatest heroes in military history. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had committed a sacrilege. He had stood on hallowed ground and tried to spit on it, only to find that the ground itself had risen up to rebuke him. His arrogance, his pride, his entire sense of self-worth, crumbled to dust in the space of a single horrifying revelation. The atmosphere on the range transformed. The air, already thick with heat and tension, now crackled with a new, potent energy. The soldiers, who had been watching a stunning display of marksmanship, now understood they had been in the presence of something far more profound. They were staring at a piece of living history, a woman who had walked through fires they could only imagine. The story of what happened here would be told in barracks and ready rooms for years to come, a cautionary tale about the dangers of judging a book by its cover, or a warrior by her rank. General Thorne stood immobile, the sergeant major's words and his aide's confirmation echoing in the cavern of his skull. He looked at Anya, who had now finished clearing her weapon and was calmly wiping it down with an oiled cloth. He was, for the first time, truly seeing her. He saw the quiet confidence not as insubordination, but as the earned tranquility of someone who had faced the worst the world had to offer and had not been broken. He saw the stillness not as passivity, but as an immense, contained power. He saw the woman he had dismissed as a clerk and recognized the soul of a warrior that burned brighter than his own. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, stealing the air from his lungs. In that moment, all his rank, his ambition, and his authority meant nothing. He was a small man standing in the shadow of a giant. Slowly, deliberately, he took a single step forward. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He did not speak. Words were useless now, hollow and inadequate to express the depth of his error and the magnitude of her reality. Instead, he raised his right hand to the brim of his patrol cap and executed the sharpest, most formal, most deeply felt salute of his entire decorated career. It was not the salute of a general to a specialist. It was the salute of one soldier to another, an acknowledgement of superior skill, superior courage, and superior character. It was an apology, a concession, and a tribute, all rendered in a single silent gesture. Anya paused her work. She turned her head and looked directly at him. Her eyes held no triumph, no anger, no "I told you so." There was only a calm, quiet acceptance. She did not salute back. In her world, such formalities had long been stripped away, leaving only the core of action and consequence. Instead, she gave him a short, precise nod. It was a gesture of closure. The apology was accepted. The matter was finished. The general's salute was a signal. It broke the spell that had held the other soldiers captive. One by one, they followed his lead. Colonel Davies saluted. Sergeant Major Vance saluted. The range safety officer saluted. The platoon of young soldiers, their rifles held loosely in their hands, all turned to face her and rendered a salute. Corporal Carter, his eyes shining with tears of awe, delivered a salute so crisp it seemed to make the air pop. It was a silent, spontaneous wave of respect, a chorus of gestures that spoke louder than any commendation ever could. They were saluting the legend, but they were also saluting the woman, the quiet professional who had asked for nothing and had proven everything. The desert range had become a cathedral, and they were all bearing witness. The moment, charged and silent, eventually passed. The salutes were dropped, but the atmosphere of profound respect remained, a permanent change in the climate of the base. Anya turned away from the crowd, her obligation to them fulfilled. She returned her full attention to the M107A1, her movements as deliberate and focused as they had been before the first shot was fired. This was her sanctuary, her ritual. The world outside, with its politics and its posturing, its generals and its privates, could fade away. Here, there was only the clean, reassuring reality of steel, oil, and precision engineering. She began to field strip the weapon. Her hands moved with an expert's economy, disassembling the complex machine with an ease that was mesmerizing to watch. The heavy bolt carrier group slid out with a well-oiled whisper. The massive barrel was unlocked and removed. The trigger assembly was detached. Soon, the components of the powerful rifle lay on a canvas mat, a puzzle of perfectly machined parts. This was her meditation. It was how she centered herself, how she processed the world. Each piece was wiped down, inspected for wear, and given a light coat of oil. She wasn't just cleaning a tool. She was caring for a part of herself. This rifle had been her constant companion in the loneliest places on earth. It had been her voice when words were useless, her shield when there was no cover. The bond between them was absolute. General Thorne watched her for a long time, his face a mixture of shame and a newfound, humbling wisdom. He had come to FOB Terminus to showcase the future of warfare, a soulless machine of sensors and servos. Instead, he had been given a brutal, unforgettable lesson in the enduring power of the human spirit, embodied in a single quiet woman whom the world had tried to forget. He gave a quiet order to his aide. The congressional delegation was discreetly led away, their minds reeling from a demonstration far more impressive than the one they had been promised. Without another word, Thorne turned and walked away from the range. His posture was different. The arrogant stride was gone, replaced by the more measured, thoughtful gait of a man who had been fundamentally changed. Anya worked in silence, oblivious to the departure of the general and his entourage. The other soldiers kept a respectful distance, speaking in hushed tones, if they spoke at all. Corporal Carter remained, watching her, trying to burn every detail of the moment into his memory. He watched as she finished her work, reassembling the rifle with the same care and precision. The parts came together with a series of satisfying, solid clicks, once again forming the potent whole. She worked the action one last time, listening to the sound, feeling its movement, ensuring it was perfect. Finally, she was done. She placed the M107A1 into its long, black hardshell case, securing it in its foam-lined cradle. She closed the lid, the latches snapping shut with loud clicks that echoed in the quiet afternoon. Hoisting the heavy case to her shoulder, she balanced it with practiced ease. As the sun began its slow descent towards the blood-red mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the desert floor, Anya Petrova walked away from the firing line. She headed back towards the simple, anonymous buildings of the armory, her footsteps steady on the gravel path. Her shadow stretched out long behind her. A tall, solitary figure merged with the silhouette of the great rifle she carried. She did not look back. She sought no further acknowledgement, no praise, no recognition. The respect she had earned today was merely an echo of the self-respect she had never lost. She was Kestrel. She was Anya Petrova. She was a soldier. And in the quiet dignity of her solitary walk, that was more than enough.